Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to all of you, depending on where you live. My name is Cynthia Malone, and I am here today to talk to you about how I believe cognitive load is affected by virtual learning environments. If you are here and you are an educator, instructional designer, curriculum developer, or anyone that has the job of educating students, then this presentation is designed with you in mind. In the last year and a half, we have all experienced or encountered individuals who have been tasked with the engagement or engaging in this new digital form of learning. The sad part is many of our educators were not completely prepared for the shift to online teaching in this virtual space. COVID-19 has given cause to the rise in virtual learning environments. And although there are many theories on how humans process information, integrating multimedia in the virtual learning space brings a different variable to the forefront of information processing where the research is lacking. Many of our K-12 students performed below their average ability last year due to the change in this instructional medium. Okay, the very fact of using a virtual space for learning became a distraction to many K-12 students. Now, I've seen this personally with my own grandchildren who also had to attend school virtually last year. It became a big distraction for them. And unfortunately, they did not perform as well as they could have being in person. Now, students contend with many distractions in the virtual learning environment. And while educators fight to capture their attention to provide instruction, the need for new instructional strategies are becoming a necessary means. So my goal here today is to share with you why developing new pedagogical strategies are needed in this new normal of digital age teaching in virtual learning environments. So let's talk about information processing, okay? Cognitive science is the science that explains how the brain processes and stores information. Essentially, information processing is when information enters the brain through one of our 5 senses, which we call the sensory memory. Then the information is passed through to the working memory, where it is processed and models and schemas are made. Then the relevant information is kept and passed to long-term memory, where it is stored. And then irrelevant information is discarded. So cognitive load theory speaks to how much information can be held in those memory storages by way of an individual's intrinsic, extraneous, and germane capacities. Hanafin et al. Writes that intrinsic cognitive load reflects the difficulty inherent in the information to be learned. Germane cognitive load reflects the effort needed to create relevant schemas and models for future learning. And extraneous cognitive loads reflect non-relevant cognitive requirements associated with the instructional materials, methods, and environments. For intrinsic cognitive load, if a student is required to absorb what is perceived to be complex information, it will cause the germane memory to work harder at creating the mental models and schemas necessary for long-term memory, okay? Those models and schemas is new knowledge, all right? And it makes it difficult if it's perceived to be complex. Further, if the student is expected to listen to narrated text and read written text simultaneously while viewing graphics, it becomes an extraneous overload, causing distractions and frustrations to the student, causing long-term storage of information to be hindered. Essentially, intrinsic cognitive load is greatly affected by the presentation of information. Now, germane cognitive load, or working memory, is that part of the memory that works hard to make memory connections, okay, with prior knowledge. This is to develop new knowledge and to store them in models called schemas. During learning, this can be overworked by irrelevant information called extraneous information. This extraneous information is known as irrelevant data that uses up processing capacity. So for the best possible learning to take place, cognitive load theory endeavors to reduce that extraneous cognitive load and increase the long-term memory capacity. So therefore, when we as designers are designing multimedia for online instruction, it's important to keep in mind a couple of things: the complexity of the graphic, the amount of text presented on screen, and the placement of the text on screen to promote the best possible learning experience. Now, according to the cognitive theory of multimedia learning, there are 3 types of learning or learner processes. They're called extraneous processing, essential processing, and generative processing. Now, Mayer explains that extraneous processing is that cognitive processing that does not support the instructional objective and is caused by poor instructional design. So anything that's extra, that's how I kind of put it in my own words: extra information that's really not relevant to the instruction, but it's there, right? So it takes up processing capacity, really. So the next processing is the essential processing. And this essential processing is cognitive processing aimed at representing the presented material in memory, mainly through selecting and is caused by the difficulty of the material. Again, if my 5 senses perceive that something is complex or difficult, it is or more difficult, then it's kind of hard to process that information and have it pass through to the generative processing or long-term memory, I should say. So just be mindful of the complexity of your images and such. Next, the generative processing is cognitive processing aimed at making sense of the material, mainly through organizing and integrating, and is caused by the learner's motivation to learn. In multimedia design, it is important for designers to understand the cognitive theory of multimedia learning and how it relates to instruction. Content selection should be made as to not overload or overwork the working memory. Excuse me. So now let's move on to the processing channels. Excuse me. Mutlu Bayraktar writes that cognitive load theory of multimedia learning assumes, first of all, that audio and video are processed through different cognitive channels. Okay, we were talking about the 5 senses. These are pretty much, we're talking about the sensory channels. Okay. Second, it assumes that each of those channels have limited space for processing. And third, students experience active learning by accessing relatable information, then organizing the selected information through mental structures and integrating them with previous mental structures. Okay. So what we do is when new information is taken in, we try to make that information relatable to something that we know or have learned in the past. And then what this does is when we integrate those together, we create new structures to create new structures of new knowledge. Okay, we're building, think of it as building structures. The cognitive channels are known as the individual's separate sensory channels used to take in and process information. And they are the visual pictorial processing channels and the auditory verbal processing channels. So in multimedia instruction, the eyes initially accept the presentation of simultaneous graphics and on-screen text and attempts to process them both through the visual and pictorial channels, However, because the space in the channels are limited, both the graphics and the on-screen text compete equally for the same restricted visual attention or visual space. Therefore, when information is concurrently presented with both graphics and on-screen text, students may not be able to properly process the information as they will either focus on graphics or on-screen text, but not both. This is because the visual pictorial channels become overloaded. So to mitigate the visual overload, present explanations as narrated text, where the ears accept the verbal information and processes it through the auditory and verbal channels, while at the same time, graphics are being processed through visual and pictorial channels, and neither of the channels are being overloaded. Mayer suggests that Mayer suggests that some principles for developing multimedia instruction to help manage essential processing. All right, and some of these principles are things called segmenting, pre-training, modality, that's to mitigate essential processing. All right, to help with that, to help manage it, not mitigate, I'm sorry, to help manage essential processing. Additionally, he suggests the following principles to promote generative processing. And those principles are personalization, voice, and embodiment. Now, voice it's funny because voice, we're using that now in this presentation. Really simply, voice is using a more of a human voice to do narration as opposed to a computer generated voice to do narrations. It just seems to be a little more personable, right? Now you can learn more about these principles in the journal article titled Using Multimedia for E-Learning, and it can be found in the Journal of Computer Assisted Learning. So why is all this information about information processing and cognitive theory of multimedia learning so important? Well, it's because the goal of instruction is to transfer knowledge, right? And for students to acquire that knowledge. Instructional designers have the challenge of integrating multimedia within course materials while considering the principles of cognitive load and keeping in mind the limitations of an individual's capacity to process that information. The goal here is not to overload working memory, causing an ineffective transfer of information to long-term memory. The whole goal is for them to make those structures, to make those connections, and to build knowledge. That's the whole goal, to pass the information into our working memory so that it can pass through to long-term memory. All right. So we're going to talk just a few seconds or a few minutes about this redundancy principle, which is a very important principle in multimedia instruction. In education, the ability to process information is pivotal for the intent of acquiring knowledge and storing data in long-term memory. Acquiring information both visually on screen and audibly through narration while simultaneously viewing graphics can cause an overload on the visual channels and verbal channels, resulting in mental fatigue. This can happen not only in multimedia instruction, but also when viewing media for entertainment. For example, have you ever watched a movie with closed captions? Have you ever noticed that it is difficult to watch the movie and read the text at the bottom of the screen at the same time while listening to the audio? I don't know about you, but I either watch the movie while listening to the audio, or I'll read the text while listening to the audio. But I can't focus on both at the same time. Why? Because it becomes a distraction. I can't view it. This is known as what we call split attention effect, right? So it really doesn't matter the motive for viewing the media. It doesn't matter your motive, whether you're going to view media for instruction or whether you're going to view media for entertainment. Overloading the visual and verbal channels with video, audio, and redundant text on screen will have an effect on your cognitive load. All right, so it just doesn't matter. Now, although the redundancy principle suggests that students learn better when graphics and narration are presented together without printed words without printed words on screen, in some cases, Lee and Mayer suggest there are boundaries or violations where the modality and redundancy principles may not apply, such as when learning occurs in one second language. The rationale is when students are learning for foreign languages, better understanding may occur when written text and narrated words are presented on screen with graphics rather than just narration presented with graphics alone. And this is because of the different dialects spoken with the words. It may be more difficult for a person learning in a second language to understand and process. Other cases where modality and redundancy principles do not apply are times when learners are extremely unfamiliar with the material. Another is when the material is very technical in nature. And this is another good one. The material is system-paced vice student-paced. Now that's very important because if you are watching a video, but you don't have the ability to stop the video and go back to re-listen to a portion of that video or to take notes on what is said, it becomes difficult for you to process when something is just being played to your visual channels without you having the ability to stop and rewind. Another is when the information is very lengthy. Now, the virtual learning environment is the wave of the future. It truly brings the idea of connectivism to life. Akbari defines virtual environments as a term used to explain distance education, where participants, instructors, and resources are not physically located close together geographically. In other words, they can attend class from anywhere because they're brought together through interactive telecommunication systems. Now, the sweet spot about the virtual learning environment is that students can communicate regularly with their instructors and make connections with their classmates. Now, distance education can be synchronous or asynchronous, where the synchronous learning involves live interactions between all the participants through live chats and video teleconferencing, whereas asynchronous learning means students and instructors do not participate at the same time or place and communicate through email, videotape, and discussion boards. However, both bring their own sets of challenges when integrating multimedia. Facilitators must take into account that students may have challenges with bandwidth, slow internet speed, and connections in their various locations. Now, I work in an international company, and we service students from all over. And I've experienced these very issues where there's bandwidth, slow internet speed. And what happens in those synchronous times is the students become very, they become distracted, they become frustrated. A lot of the times they lose their connection and it's difficult for them to log back in. And so it becomes a challenge in those spaces. Not only that, but with the slow internet speed, it causes graphics and text presentation challenges, as well as challenges with the audio where the facilitator may freeze, okay? And so they can't see or hear exactly what's being said. So one of the things we try to do to mitigate some of these issues is we give a lot of pre-work so that they can at least be familiar with the information that is going to be presented during the block of instruction that we are training. Now, since the cognitive theory of multimedia learning is dependent on how information is presented and cognitive processing capacity, implementing modality and redundancy principles may be at times a challenge, especially when we're doing the synchronous type of instruction with international students. However, Clark and Mayer explained that during synchronous delivery of instruction in the virtual learning environment, one advantage is the use of facilitator speech to explain graphics or illustrate technical steps, as well as provide explanations on what is expected. This medium also allows students to interact with facilitators in real time when they're having difficulty with information processing. Now, in addition to the bandwidth issues, facilitators may be unfamiliar with the virtual learning platform. And with synchronous deliveries, this can become frustrating to the student as well, especially if the material is presented with many delays due to the technical challenges. Finally, the facilitator has the challenge of managing the virtual class of students from many different backgrounds. Some may be learning in their native language, while others may not. Therefore, the language barriers are a big consideration where redundancy violations may apply. Now, while facilitators have the challenge of presenting various types of material on distance learning platforms, it is imperative that material be presented in such a way as that it does not become a distraction to the learner and cause information processing to be hindered. Now let's talk about the Universal Design for Learning, UDL. Merrier and Rossi explained that the UDL framework has 4 pillars: establishing goals, instructional methods, content materials, and assessing learning. Now, it is built on 3 principles, and those 3 principles are engagement, representation, and action and expression. It is designed to remove barriers to instruction and learning by promoting flexibility within the framework. This is important because educators are encouraged and nowadays more likely to have to incorporate a variety of multimedia within the UDL framework to meet the objective of flexibility in true learning and instruction. All right, especially in light of COVID-19, we've had to get very creative. Wilson et al. Explains that UDL is a flexible curriculum design model that allows educators to assess actual learning in a broader scope. It expands the ability for educators to use various methods of instruction and provides a variety of options for how students engage in the learning process and respond to instruction or demonstration of knowledge. So the first principle, which is the means of engagement, is used to capture the student's attention and keep them engaged in the learning process while helping them to become active learners on their own. The goal of this principle is to provide options that promote continued motivation and interest in learning. This requires educators and instructional designers to be creative in their efforts to provide flexibility for advancing students through the content material and express learning. There is no one size fits all. Again, I'll repeat that. There is no one size fits all method when it comes to learning, and the multiple means of engagement removes the barrier to motivating one to learn on their own and in their own way. The second principle, multiple means of representation, is the strategies by which educators use to present learning materials. This is really important and where we're really focused in on. Merrier and Rossi explained that teachers support student learning when they include a variety of methods and materials. For example, charts, videos, texts, illustrations, for, just to name a few, to present content to students during instruction. Students' access to learning content is vital for cognitive advancement, and integrating multimedia, gamification, and artificial intelligence are just a few ways in which this principle is satisfied. Now, the last principle, multiple means of action and expression, is used to assess acquired knowledge. This is a powerful principle as it allows the students the flexibility to demonstrate their learning through various methods. This principle removes the barrier of expressed learning in a specified manner. Again, there's no one size fits all model that, if not met, one is labeled as a struggling student. Now, I think this is very important because there are some who are not great test takers. And, traditionally, that's what we're used to. You teach a block of instruction, then you give a person a written test, or nowadays you put them on the computer and you have some multiple choice questions, some true and false questions, some essay questions, the whole nine. Okay. But there are some who are not good at those forms of tests. So you have to have some flexibility in allowing a student to demonstrate how they've learned the material. And the UDL principle, or the UDL model, is a great model for this type of learning. So in conclusion, all right, we're almost done here. Stay with me just a second. The practice of incorporating graphics, narration, and written words into a computer-aided instruction has been used by many instructional designers in the attempt to enhance learning, although the modality principle suggests that explaining visuals with audio alone promotes the best learning. Clark and Mayer say that viewing graphics while listening to narrated text and reading text simultaneously on screen is distracting and causes a hindrance with processing the information being presented due to an overload on the visual and verbal channels. And that causes extraneous cognitive load. While word and picture locality are important, the principles of good instructional design, coupled with the knowledge of how people learn, is essential for deeper learning to take place. In light of how extraneous cognitive load is affected in virtual learning environments, if several sources of information are being presented at the same time, one would contend that the very nature of using this virtual medium of instruction causes extraneous cognitive load. And more research should be conducted on inventing new pedagogical strategies for multimedia instruction for synchronous learning in virtual learning environments to increase attention, motivation, and essential learning, and reducing frustration. New multimedia design frameworks may be necessary in this growing world of virtual learning, especially when capturing the attention of low experienced learners or those learners who are learning in a second language. Today's educational environment has been pushed to the limit with the onset of COVID-19. Educators have had to learn new pedagogical strategies to meet the needs of students, and the UDL principles are ideal for meeting this challenge. Although I do believe there is a need for additional research on integrating different forms of multimedia and pedagogical strategies within the UDL framework as it pertains to virtual learning environments. There are many useful multimedia instructional tools used for asynchronous learning. However, for synchronous learning, these instructional tools are limited. Thank you for listening to my presentation, and I look forward to many more. And again, thank you. God bless.